so I can speak to them, although obviously I don't need a microphone to speak to you. Can I just check that this is, yeah, is that right? That's okay. Brilliant. Well, very, very warm welcome this evening. My name's Claire Goff. I am director here at Pitzhanger Manor and Gallery, and an absolute delight to welcome you to talk about this fabulous new building that we've just completed, just opened, that we're referring to as the Hub at Pitzhanger, because it is at the hub of everything we do. And I'm absolutely delighted we've got Steve Webb and Joe Townsend, who were the creative team behind the creation of the Hub. And so they were going to give you a bit more detail about how we got there. I am just the client. All I did was I set them a really big challenge and they have more than delivered it. So I am so excited and really excited to share tonight with you how successfully they achieved and delivered our vision. So I'm just going to start taking a step back for a second, looking at where we started. So in 2016, as Rosa will know all too well, we embarked on a fabulous project to restore and renew and conserve John Soane's country house, Pitzhanger Manor, and refurbish the gallery, as well as building the cafe in the walled garden. And it was an amazing project and very all-time consuming. And as any of you who've ever done a building project will know, you don't really want to do other projects afterwards, but it was very clear to us quite early that there was one thing that was missing from this. In order to run the fabulous Pitzhanger, we are very reliant on an amazing team of volunteers. They are invaluable to us. They open up the house, they're there to guide our visitors round, they help with the gardening, they help with running some of our education workshops. And we had no space where they could put their feet up after a tough stint, where they could research information for their tours, where they could just generally chat and congregate. And we knew that we needed to have a space to look after them. At the same time, our offices were in here in Soane's old lodge building, listed lodge building. And this was an unused courtyard. In fact, what happens when you have an unused courtyard? I'm just going to canter through a couple of images. Here to this one, really, which gives you a taste. This is, here we go, here's the lodge, and here is where we are today. This delightful building here is a portaloo. So what happens to an unused courtyard during a building project? It becomes the dumping ground. So the portaloo was probably one of its more glamorous moments. Otherwise, any piece of stone, anything left over from the conservation project is dumped in there. At one stage, we had this fabulous sign saying Pitzhanger is open, while we were very definitely unopened, sort of sitting here. There was a huge tree trunk going out of the corner of there. But we said, actually, if the portaloo wasn't here, this is quite a big space. This would deliver exactly the room that we need, and also amazingly give us a meeting room that we don't have for board meetings and so on. So we started coming up with a plan that this is what we wanted to do, was to convert this courtyard into something much more useful. But, and this is really important to us, John Soane is such an innovative architect, and our mission at Pitzhanger is to pick up from the legacy of John Soane and use his architecture here to inspire and enthuse people in art, architecture and design. So we knew that if we were going to do a piece of contemporary building here next to John Soane's Grade 1 listed lodge building, it needed to be really innovative, really beautiful, and be the top rate of contemporary design sitting within a historic context. So we put it out to tender to find an architect and the supporting design team to work on it. And my goodness, did we give them quite a tough brief. So here I'm just going to take you back to Pitzhanger, and we said, be inspired by John Soane and by Pitzhanger, be inspired by the roof light that sits on top of Soane's Manor. And there you see it in a bit more detail, that fabulous dramatic roof light that sits on top of the building, and create us this amazing space that during the day will be the volunteers' hub, and at night we can give to the community of Ealing as a space where they can have meetings for their societies and their groups and so on. Just to give you a sense of the challenge that Joe faced, is the wall. This is the wall facing into Pitzhanger Gardens. It's completely higgledy-piggledy. It's not even like a castle with a crenellated finish. It's up and down and up, and this hilarious, wonderful, huge big bit of wall built to hold the plaque that talks about the opening of Pitzhanger Walpole Park, the park to the public. Huge, big, wonderful 1901 plaque naming every member of the council who'd worked towards that. So it was not an obvious job for Jo when she started, but we had a tender process, and we thought Jo Townsend Architects really, really responded to her brief. So we were absolutely delighted to appoint Jo and say, create something beautiful, pragmatic, that really works, and make it award-winning, inspirational, picking up from John Soane. So that was the easy challenge that we gave to Jo with very little money to do it. And Jo has delivered everything we'd asked for. So I'm now going to pass over to Jo and Steve to take you forwards on how they did that.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk to you a bit, first of all, about the design process, more the contextual and Soanian influences, and I think then Steve's going to follow up with some more of the sort of structural and environmental issues afterwards. So, Jo Townsend Architects, we are a small practice based in South East London. We are experienced in dealing with tight urban sites and heritage contexts, but crucially, we're not conservation architects, and nor are we architectural historians specialising in Soane. But we've become so. We've become more of that. Beyond the relatively simple programmatic brief that we were given to provide a space primarily for volunteers working here at Pitzhanger, we were asked, as 21st century architects, how do we respond to John Soane's legacy? And we formulated the question, what would John Soane do now? So the site, this is the site plan. This is where we're sitting right now, here in the space here. And the site was, as already described, it was a courtyard building surrounded by walls, existing walls that were listed in some cases. And as you can see, and as most of you must know from other visits here, this is Pitzhanger, and we say it's in the literal and metaphorical shadow of Pitzhanger Manor. So this is the photo of the lodge and the walls, as you can see here. The lodge was built, presumed to be built at the same time as Soane's work and the entrance arch, and both are listed. The wall here, this wall is listed, but these walls aren't listed, but they are deemed to have important local heritage value, and it's incredible, and the plaque incredible. So we worked very closely with Ealing Conservation team, and we developed a light touch approach to the massing. Crucially, the decision was made that we had to keep the walls, that the walls had to remain. That was the first critical decision. We also, one of the first decisions we started to make was the idea of a transition space, how to deal with the facade of the existing lodge, and how we could create a space and how that space would link. Initially, programmatically, it was preferred to link the buildings physically, which presented a series of very problematic architectural decisions about how we would actually deal with a listed facade delicately and sensitively. We did look at several ideas. We had ideas of having a glass roof there. Obviously, programmatically, it was a transition space because of the doorway and the circulation routes between the lodge, the manor, and this space. And we also wanted to see it as a transition space architecturally. So it was always the idea that it would be a different type of space there to here. Eventually, through many different options, it was decided that the best thing was to leave it as a courtyard and to have it as a set, completely open space. And there you see the courtyard.
Which has become a lovely place for us to have our lunch and have meetings when it's sunny.
So using the decision to use the existing courtyard walls threw up a set of interesting challenges for us. And building within the courtyard, we found that we were working in a kind of hybrid type of building, because it wasn't an extension, nor was it a standalone building because of its relationship with the lodge. It wasn't a new build, nor was it refurbishment. So we found that we kind of always kept slipping between two stools and how you might justify or consider the building. Well, Steve might talk later about justifying the problems with justifying the walls structurally, because they were built as garden walls, and yet we wanted to use them as built a wall to hold a building up. And that's quite an interesting issue, I think, with reuse of spaces in brownfield sites. And also how to make these garden walls become firmly and dry and firmly efficient to create a warm space. Another technical challenge was that, as you mentioned earlier, the walls were not orthogonal. They were not orthogonal in plan, and they weren't orthogonal in section. So, they sort of wobble all over the place. But there's a very strong kink there, and I don't know if you can see that we've actually built. The roof is orthogonal. We made a decision to build the new roof orthogonally and have it sitting on top of these sort of wobbly walls.
Can you tell me what orthogonal is?
Sorry, yes, good point. Orthogonal means on the XY axis, so okay. It means right angles and everything.
I figured it was that, right?
No, thank you. It's a bit of jargon, yeah.
So I'm gonna jump in and just say, as a complete layperson, so if you look at it and you see this when you leave today, it's rather fun that you can see that corner sticks out a bit over there to make up for the fact that this. So now you've been inside, you'll spot that when you're outside.
It always be in my mind.
Yeah.
And it was quite a deliberate decision to do that, and it was almost to have a bit of fun really with the sort of old and the new, and see where that would go. So obviously, what would John Stone do now? We had to develop a response to that question. His work is famously rich and multi-layered, and we could have taken it in so many different directions. The areas that we explored were notions of buildings within buildings, glazed lantern structures, ceiling architecture, internal lightweight tensile forms, geometric artifice, ambivalence to resolution, the use of innovative technologies, and crucially the play of light. So using the external walls, we made a decision quite early on that we needed to take the higgledy-piggledy and calm all of that down a bit and try to respond to the rigor of Pitzhanger Manor, and to create a sort of visual order and clarity to our intervention. So we very quickly decided to bring up, to form a datum, and the data that we chose was the height of the lower wall on Mattock Lane. And here's an early drawing that we did that was exploring how all the different varying heights, how we would work with them. So we have a wall that's higher, we have a wall that's exactly the right height, we have a wall where our roof just tucks under the wall here, and then we had walls that were much lower. And so we built the walls up to the statum, and the statum became a strong visual reference point all the way through. Okay. So we wanted the wall, aesthetically, we wanted that, especially the wall here facing Pitzhanger, to be read as a single wall. But we wanted the history and the contours of the wall to be legible when looked at closely. So there was this sort of double reading of the wall, really, but it wasn't something that shouted at you, but it was there. So I'm just going to go back to taking this approach, though, of building the walls up and retaining the masonry walls meant that we didn't have any opportunities to get natural light or ventilation into the space at lower level below this datum. And so at that point, that was where we decided, and in response to the Sonian lantern, which you can see just popping up behind there, we decided to use the idea of a glazed lantern to create the roof on which the wall that sat on top of the walls. Here you can just see it popping out behind the taller bit of matted wood. There. And there you can see the idea of the roof just sitting on top of the walls, coming down as a lantern. So it's a very, from the outside, it's a very modest building, sitting quietly against its neighbour. So Steve will talk about the joys of making that work structurally, that decision. So Soane was known, he was called as a ceiling architect by the 20th century architect Philip Johnson. And there are so many beautiful examples of his ceilings, even here at Pitzhanger, but elsewhere. His work is described as playful. He was not rigid in his use of geometric form, nor is he concerned in resolving or explaining the structural resolution of his work. This playfulness allowed us to feel that we could take a form and play with it. So what we did is we took one of an idea of what his handkerchief ceilings, which where you have the dome that comes down in the four corners. It's meant to represent, it's described as a handkerchief ceiling because it's the idea of a handkerchief being blown up in the air and the four corners tethered. And we decided to dissect and mirror through the two axes that ceiling in order to respond to the lantern and to allow light in. So you can sort of begin to see the shape that's formed by doing that. So that was the very early drawing to exploring that idea. And this is what's led to this undulating form, if you like. It's the generation of this shape. Another of Soane's qualities of his work is the play of light, and so we've particularly enjoyed the play of light that falls on the fins and how that changes through the day. And also he liked to use mirrors, and we've put where Mattock Lane wall is higher and where we couldn't get glazing, we've put mirrors in to sort of bounce some light around and be playful. So he was known as well for his innovative approach to building, and actually his use of very simple building materials. He was actually criticised at the time for his use of simple brickwork. So we very much enjoyed the idea of using simple materials, and I think Steve will talk more about that, but this is used with just sheets of ply, standard sheets of ply. The original ceiling that we were talking about was formed by a tensile structure, which is like a stretched shape. We decided to do a modern interpretation of that through a sort of visual appearance of that by the creating of fins, like a contours that are cut out of vertical fins, rather than actually trying to replicate a tensile structure. Each fin was designed and drawn in CAD, in computer-aided design, and then sent off to a fabricator who cut them out. Each fin was then delivered. It has if you look very closely, you can see that there's a number on it, on each fin, so that they could be assembled on site by the very clever contractor, very impressive contractor. And structurally, Steve will talk about the structure and how it appears to sort of float. There is, and again, there's not a strong sort of visual structural resolution of the ceiling and the roof. And this is how the the roof is put together without any screws. That's right, isn't it? And it's called a tab and wedge, and I think Steve will go on from there.
Yeah, okay, sure.
I'm going to just very quickly interrupt because I should have said this at the beginning, and forgive me for not saying it before. Please, I know one of you already has, just put up your hands if you want to ask a question at any stage if anything's not clear. I'm very happy to take, we'll obviously have questions at the end, but happy to have any questions. So has anybody got any question before we move on to Steve?
Could I just say, if you turn the lights off, we wouldn't have the glare from the.
Very good.
Yeah.
We'll do that. Thank you.
In the daylight.
You have the 3 walls on this side, it gives an always plus the roof, isn't it?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you say it again?
So always plus the roof. on
Yes.
this side, isn't it? How did you deal with water? Or is that purposely the wall?
Yeah, it just meets the wall, that's
It just
right, and
meets
the
the
wall,
wall.
yeah, that's right, yeah.
Let's hear a bit more about walls, or do you want to say bigger questions? To the
What do you think? Walls now? Or were you going to explain walls more?
I was going to talk about walls.
Why don't you let Steve talk about walls and keep that
Maybe
going?
I'll, what was it about walls?
Oh,
Give me a hint, and then I'll see if I can
ridiculously, I didn't realise walls could be listed, of course it's obvious, isn't it? Does the same sort of tiered system apply to walls, like grade 1, 2, don't touch it, too expensive, move kind of criteria apply?
I think it would be difficult for a wall to have a very high grading because that's often about interiors. So I think, and often walls are usually listed because they're in what's called in the Kirkage of a listed building. So they're listed because they form part of something else. So a wall is very rarely listed on its own merits. It's usually because it's part of a bigger context.
And I wondered what work you've done to the original walls, but maybe that will emerge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Or
think
more than
Steve,
we
you're going to
want-
talk a
more
bit
than we
more.
want to.
Yes.
It's a good question. You anticipated something there.
So our company is Webb Yates, and I'm Steve Webb, and we are the structural engineers working with Joe to develop the design. We're 60 people, and we generally, we do some small projects, but we generally work on bigger projects than this, and we work from very small scales up to big things at the airport. But we're really concerned in general, and this is not very Sonian actually, we're concerned with making structure really interesting so that you don't want to cover it in plasterboard, and making the structure part of the architecture, which is I think something that Son really didn't give anything about. And secondly, also trying to be very frugal with the materials that we use, and trying to use materials that have low energy, low embodied carbon, and do as little as possible. And particularly when you're refurbishing old buildings, it's very tempting to stick in steels and pour in loads of concrete, but actually what we try and do is to do the minimum amount possible and make everything work.
And I'll just say,
Uh,
yeah, well, I would just
You
say,
might do it now.
Son was very innovative. So I would like to think that he would be worrying about that today.
Yeah.
The other thing Son was brilliant at was recycling. So he would have things left over from other projects and he would reuse them, as you see a lot in Pitzhanger, from the caryatids and the staircase and lots of other things, the arches and so on. So I hope he might have picked up the baton. Not so great on the first point, but on the recycling point.
It's an interesting, in building is a massive part of the carbon climate change problem. Concrete and steel particularly are things that have come about as a result of the coal and the fossil fuel era, which is a very short, for thousands of years that we've been building, there's 150 years of fossil fuels, and we build with huge amounts of energy. And Son was at the beginning of that, and we're, I guess, coming down the other side. So he was entering an environment where they were industrializing coal production, mass construction in bricks, but they didn't really have steel and stuff yet. And we're at the other side of that thing where we really need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and start going back to timber and low energy materials. So that's our approach to wherever we can, to all buildings. And we think in general that, for example, forests and quarries are better than blast furnaces and clinker mills and things like that. So we try and use materials that have less energy. And those decisions are very important. So your personal carbon footprint, if you fly on holiday and eat meat and whatever, it's probably about 10 tons. But as a practicing engineer, we design hundreds of tons of steel every year. And so our carbon footprints are in the thousands of tons, not tens of tons. So we try and make decisions based on how we can minimize those things. So this is a diagram just comparing apples with apples from a carbon perspective. And it's beam spanning 2 meters holding up a 1-ton car, and all of the black rectangles at the top are structural sections that are strong enough to do that job. So you need an 8x4-inch piece of timber, or just a 2.1 millimeter slither of steel, 28 millimeters of concrete. And at the bottom are the carbon footprints for all of those materials. So if you use a steel beam, you make 22 kilograms per meter. And if you use a timber beam, you use about 5. So there's a huge difference in that decision. So when people are building blocks of flats or offices, if they stick steel and concrete in them, there are massive carbon consequences for all of us, climate change. And if you're able to use timber, you really should. And that's the same for house extensions and little projects like this as it is with big ones. So our approach with this is really been to try and A, do as little as possible, B, use natural materials, use timber, not use concrete, steel, and to do as little as we possibly could with the existing courtyard. So when we came to this, there's 4 walls, and most engineers will come and go, oh, that looks a bit dodgy, what are we going to do with this wall? But actually, there's a great big sign on the wall saying 1832. And you think if something stood for 1832, I can't remember, 170 years, 190 years, the wall has been here, and I'm going to come along and go, oh, I don't really trust this based on my limited experience. So my attitude is, the wall's been here forever. What's the problem? And particularly with reference to the wall, you know, we didn't want to do anything to it. So what we've done is to this floor, rather than putting a concrete floor on the ground, we've spanned a wooden floor between the existing brickwork walls. So there's a gap of about this much underneath here. It's the ground underneath, which you can feel.
Have a priest hole or something down there.
Yeah. Those are going to come into use again. Possibly. And it's quite a long span, so it's about 5 meters. And in order to do that, you need quite a big timber. So what we've done is what we call a stress skin. So we have a series of joists, and we glue a plywood layer on the top of those joists, so that when the joists deflect, the plywood is compressed. And so what's under your feet is not a decorative floor finish, it's the structural top of the floor structure. So actually what's here inside that timber is the compression of the span of the floor, and there's underfloor heating. Okay, there isn't underfloor.
It was literally.
I think maybe we were gonna do that.
At one point, yeah, we did.
So the alternative and the usual approach to this would be dig it all out, dig a load of footings, probably knock the walls down, build a new cavity wall, pour 50 million tons of concrete in here, have a big concrete slab with some insulation and a screed and whatever, and you know, all the carbon goes into that atmosphere. So what we try to do is keep the walls span from one side to the other. We looked at, so we're really concerned about building in trees and clay environments. There are some pretty honking big cypresses just out of the window, and building control and saying, well, what about the trees? And we kind of dug some holes and we found a bit of clay in the holes, but actually the local boreholes were showing gravel. And so we had a lot of, so we were saying, look, the wall's been there for 170 years. Why do anything about it? Every Victorian house in London has inadequate foundations. Quite often they're built next to trees. They're built in clay. By and large, they don't have a problem. Every now and again they do, for whatever reason. So we were arguing, just leave it. And they really insisted and dug in, and we had to do a bit of underpinning at the tree end of the building, really reluctantly. And actually, when they did that underpinning, they discovered that further down it was gravel, and that's why there wasn't a problem with the trees. And so the underpinning was completely unnecessary. So we were fighting against building control, you know, arguing with them quite some length. And you know, ultimately, you can fight with the traffic warden, but you're going to get fucking taken.
Did you do any site investigation for it?
No, we did dig some holes, and we saw gravel. We saw some gravel in the holes, and also we saw some clay. And you know, they always err on the side of caution. And again, for a project like this, the budget is absolutely tiny, and you can spend £50,000 digging boreholes, and you know, I think it's a waste of money. So, well, anyway, so we had a bit of underpinning. And then likewise, the roof, there wasn't a massive budget for this building, and we wanted this beautiful feature roof. So how can we do it economically? And the main thing is the dimension. So it's a deep piece of timber, and it's 5.5 meters long. So it's quite difficult to get natural timber at that length. So you need to make it with a board. The plywood boards are at the maximum 3 meters by 1.5 meters. So a plywood board isn't enough to stretch from one end to the other. There are other kinds of boards that you can import from Germany. There's a board called Baubuche, which I think we were looking at one point, which is a veneered beech piece of timber that comes in much longer pieces that we could cut, but it's imported and it's quite expensive. And so we're trying to find a really economical way of putting this thing up. So the idea was, the plywood's not long enough. How do we join it together? So the shape of the handkerchief is perfect for the structural beams because they're deep in the middle, and we have all these ribs, so it's an ideal form span from one side to the other. But how do we join them together in the middle to make 2-3 meter lengths of plywood into one 5.5 meter length? So the little arrows that you see are like toggles that tie one side of this to the other, and the arrow shapes are not willful shapes. They're inverted wedges, so that you transfer the load into the shoulders of the wedge, and the size of the web diminishes into the section, and you have this little tie all the way across. So those are completely structural elements. And then when you have a beam that spans, the bottom is in tension and the top's in compression, so you have to transfer the compression, and the plywood on the top surface has a, actually I should be, sorry,
sorry, I did it for you. Sorry, I thought it might be useful.
So the little tabs and wedges connect the plywood on the top to the beams underneath, and the plywood in the middle carries the compression. So it's pushing on the plywood and it's pulling on the little toggles underneath, and it spans from one side to the other. So a sheet of plywood costs £100. It costs £50 to CNC it. If you can, CNC means computer controlled or computer numerical control, and you put a piece of plywood on a router, so it's like a spinning drill blade controlled by a computer, and the machine cuts all of these shapes automatically, very, very quickly,
very precisely,
and very precisely. And so you can see the precision of the cut is such that you can cut that arrow out and just slide it tightly into the hole.
I love the fact that the drawings to illustrate that are sort of hand drawn and the kind of translates into computer generated. It's kind of a wonderful kind of contrast with the intent and the reality.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, so everyone, we want engineers to, think and be, active and design, and not just kind of numerical statics consultants. So everyone in our office, and Rosie and Sarah here will testify to this, they get sent on drawing boot camp. And we have no tolerance of shit sketches. So if anyone's doing bad sketches, they get whipped to them.
The thing is that people are having, if you can, it must be like pristine and it's right, and it can't be challenged. Whereas in reality, it's just drawing whatever you decide. If
you draw in CAD, you need to know exactly where all the lines are. So you're thinking, is this 52 millimeters or is this 53 millimeters? If you're drawing by hand, you're not worried about more or less where the lines are. You're more thinking, how does it, more conceptually, and less fussed with numbers. So this sketch was, so Joe did the original handkerchief drawing with all of the blades, and we responded to that with this sketch. And I really like Gilbert and Sullivan and that Mike Lee film Topsy Turvy, which I think is a kind of Sonian era, and all the kind of curly whirly bits. So I was thinking these are like upturned moustaches with little bow ties, and so you can see that
the friendly description. The project is Pitts.
Yes, no, but that's right.
But also
What is plywood?
Oh, it's so they get well, in this case a birch tree. They get the trunks.
Where's the birch from?
Probably Finland in this case, or it's Finnish birch
Why
pine.
didn't you use German because it was important?
Well, we didn't want to specifically import those boards because those boards are quite expensive, but plywood comes here all the time.
Yeah.
So
It's Finnish.
yeah, Finnish birch. So they get the trunk of the birch tree and they unwind it against the blade. So they get a kind of veneer and then they glue them together and in opposite the grain.
And it's a good eco-sustainable timber.
Yeah.
Very stable.
Well, the glue, so obviously plywood is full of formaldehyde, so it's not as good as natural timber.
Yeah.
And it's imported from Finland, so it's not as good as a local timber, but it's much better than sticking in a load of steel beams and putting the decorative ceiling. So there's every level of sainthood we're not quite top of the tree.
Our halos are.
But so you can see with all the, we were looking at the making the bracing a bit more expressive with little arches and things like that. And I think Joe calmed us down, which is very straight braces in between. And
was there much debate over shape and form of the ploy?
well, we wanted, I was thinking it's a great, well, I used to work for a guy called Calatrava in Spain, and he always had perspectives. There were morphological moments in his buildings. And so the kind of, the joining of the two with this kind of egg shape would have been a great photograph down the middle of the roof. But that's, yeah, I think so.
So what was the budget?
Go on.
Straight in there. We haven't revealed this anyway, have we?
No.
Low, I would say, very low.
Where did the money come from?
Money came from, I'll tell you exactly where it is, you can see their names on the outside, came from trusts and foundations who were excited about what we were trying to do, excited about the way in which Joe and Steve were developing it, but also excited about supporting the volunteers who wanted to work here, and also creating a community hub that we can use for the community.
So it was all grant money.
All grant money, yeah, and one individual finished it off. So it's named after the most major donor who named it after his wife, Rachel Darroch. So it's the Rachel Darroch room, because he filled up the gap at the end.
So I just asked, you said there was just one trust or foundation?
No, they're about 5. You'll see their names listed outside.
Was there one that came along and said that we want match funding?
Yeah, no, actually that's what we started off with. So somebody called the Architectural Heritage Fund. They were absolutely brilliant, because when you first start having these ideas, you can't go and get funding from a trust fund until you've got a design. You can't afford to employ Joe and do the work that works it out when you've got no money. So we went to the Architectural Heritage Fund, who said they would give us a certain amount of match funding to work up the plans, to employ the architect, do some initial plans, get planning permission signed.
Nothing done at this.
Yeah. So we just couldn't afford to do that, because we were just finishing off this capital building, and we were trying to do this sort of semi in parallel with that, and we just couldn't afford to do anything else without it being funded. So that was brilliant, because that gave us the seed capital we needed to recruit Joe, get planning permission, do a few. I think the test pits were done with that money and so on, and then we came up with the final design. Went to the other trusts and foundations and said, now this is what we're going to do. Take it forward. It is a journey. And then COVID happens. And that I don't know whether, Joe, you're going to touch on that, but in building projects, that affects builders, whether they're available, but also massively affected. It wasn't just COVID, but it was the Suez Canal and all those things, supplies of materials. And at one stage, I can't remember what particular things were stuck in one particular implement was stuck in the Suez Canal, and that was a problem for us. So it has been complicated, and then Omicron strikes and all the builders have to go off because they've all been pinged. So it is a much more complicated journey than we would have hoped it would be, but it has been entirely funded, and we are just so thrilled with the end result.
Would it be right to assume a 7-figure sum? Are you able to go that far?
No, it's a 6-figure sum.
Oh.
Do you have any historic information on how the lodge was used? Was it a dwelling, a living place?
We think it was.
Was it that much?
Yeah, we think the lodge really was the lodge. We think it's a bit confusing what this was, and this is depicted in different ways depending on the age of the drawings that you're looking at. But we think near here were the stables. We think the lodge, if you look from the garden back at the lodge building itself, not this bit, there was a big arch, and we suspect that was probably a sort of carriage park originally, that was then later filled in. So we think Soane used it as a tiny mews type lodge for his carriage driver. And then there were stables next door and partly in here. There was some lovely, Joe mentioned this, that at one stage the plan had been to join the building to the house, And one of the many considerations that went into doing that was we just couldn't afford it within our tiny budget. And Joe was working out very hard how we could enjoy looking at this side of the lodge building. And to be completely honest, when this was a crummy courtyard, nobody did look at that building. And I don't think many people had noticed, you know, Rosa probably had, and those who've been working on the project really knew everything there was about the building. So I knew about the windows up there, but lots of people had never noticed those. What I love now is that because this is detached from the lodge, people enjoy, and through this glass window with the courtyard there, people enjoy that vista of the original Sonian wall much better than we would have done particularly had we joined it up. So I'm really pleased. I will say here, it has been a complete joy to work with this design team. At every stage when we faced a problem, it's become a challenge that we tackle together, that we debate and discuss, and we have come out with a better decision at the end. Even when we've been faced with financial challenges, I honestly believe that was a better decision, and I really take my hat off to Joe and Steve for making it such a delightful process. It's not always easy when you're working with architects on big projects, but this has been a delight. And as I say, we have grappled with real issues. I'll tell you about another one in a minute. We've grappled with real issues, and both Joe and Steve have just been really creative in their answers to make sure we get what we really needed as the end result.
And if there had not been a conservation team, as there is not now, presuming, would your job be harder or easier?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because we here, the team at Pitzhanger, the client for this work, are passionate about the conservation of Soane. So we wouldn't have wanted to not be working in a conservation way. Having a conservation team advising you from the council and thinking through listed issues is incredibly helpful when you're applying for listed building consent and so on. But we would have been champions of the conservation, because it's such an important matter for, you know, that's what Pitzhanger is here to do, is to celebrate and demonstrate the legacy of Soane. So we wouldn't have wanted to be.
Yeah, and I think we very much came to the project with the idea of enjoying the existing. We didn't really have any desire to sort of knock anything down, or, you know, we wanted, you know,
But did they add things to your?
No, it was more just advice about how to. I think there wasn't really any conflict, to be honest. I think we were all on the same page.
Yeah,
we all wanted a very light touch approach. I think perhaps we didn't understand some of the structural implications of the light touch approach, but we wanted that, and we very much wanted to celebrate what was here.
They brought to it, the structural implications.
No, that's about us making decisions, which then later down the line, the technical resolution of what might be quite problematic or tricky. But I think that's about sort of holding your nerve and carrying it through, isn't it? And saying we will find a solution.
Yeah.
And we had problems, for example, with things like damp proofing, because when you've got an existing building wall, which has never been an internal wall, and it doesn't have a damp proof, how do you create those kind of things? And that, again, with building control was very dubious, and you know, we had to.
Conservation is slightly in conflict with building regulations, because obviously in the conservation project you have an existing building that doesn't comply with any regulations, and you want to do as little as possible to it, and building control want you to upgrade it as much as possible. So there's always this. So actually they're rather in contradiction of each other.
Yeah.
So I think in a way, just going back to your question, I think this was an unusual case where actually what we were wanting to do was celebrate the historic and retain it as much as possible. And actually by using it, I think we're conserving it far better than if it had been left as it was. So certainly there was this whopping great big tree trunk, huge tree trunk going out there, about where Chloe is sitting just there. And that was damaging the wall. So by building this in here, we've saved the walls. I think they would have been at risk.
What I was trying to ask was, now there isn't a conservation team. So if you were doing it now, would it be easier?
Yes.
So if there's no conservation team, we can just knock it all down and build a block of flats.
Yeah. So I think the answer to that question, I would say, is I think a conservation team, and I know where this question is coming from, but a conservation team in Ealing is essential. But I don't think we needed it here because we're passionate about conservation at Pitzhanger Manor and Gallery Trust. That is what we are here to do. I think you're absolutely right. Conservation team in the council are really, really valuable when you're thinking about things that are done within historic sites, because that is our raison d'etre in a way. We didn't need it, and Joe and Steve were so talented they were able to identify the best ways of looking after the walls. But I think if you were talking about another site where you were starting from scratch and working out what to do with it, and it wasn't run by a trust which is a conservation trust, then you'd really miss not having their advice around.
What happens without how do they deal with conservation?
The plans deal with it.
Oh, without any.
They bring in consultants.
Oh, they outsource it to consultants. Right.
So what's the conservation?
Right.
Lots of conservation officers who knew about and the Bowers buildings.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you how are your walls actually physically attached to the brick walls?
So they don't really. So it's like a cavity wall. There's a timber frame that's built orthogonally, vertically, because actually the walls kind of moved also all over the place. That is sitting on the rafters, isn't it? They actually support
there's a section on that.
Yeah.
There's like a
There,
box
here.
within the box within
Yeah.
the surroundings.
Yeah. And so everything is very cleverly from this sort of stress floor, supported off this stress floor, which is supported off the walls. So
Back to structures, how do you transfer all that shear back to those skins over there?
So the end.
Interesting, because I can't see the beams actually being.
Yeah, so the end.
Harrisonian.
The end of the fin has a peg at the top,
Oh, I see.
and so it bears onto the ply, and the ply
And then
in
you'll be
bending
like
just
literally-
carries the but it's, I think, I mean, this is something that so as I said, we work at all scales, from really big projects to really small projects. If you really work on big projects, you would never think about doing that, because it's totally counter to what you've always been taught. But actually, at this scale, it's like furniture. It's not really. So it's the little toggle and apply.
I think we do have to refer to the very high-tech testing that we did of the roof structure. Perhaps Steve would like to outline that testing system.
Oh, we didn't have because it's a slightly unusual thing, and we want to prototype it to make sure that everything fits together. So we made one bay of this, and I was really curious to see how bouncy it was. So we set it up, and I was jumping up and down all the little. And I was also curious to see whether the little arrow thing would break.
And it didn't. Phew! This is all caught on video. But
You apply access to the whole roof.
Well, I think Claire was expecting to employ somebody to do calculations and know what they were doing, rather than just stand up and jump up and down and see what it was.
much happier with jumping up and down. That's a much, much safer test.
Well, you said that you have done the project.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Hadn't worked, you might have.
Yeah.
Get a robot to do that.
Yeah.
Did that.
So yeah, no, that's
Can I ask a very mundane question? How do you open the window?
Yeah, there is, you might have noticed me do it actually, when I was turning off the lights. I was trying to see if I could have them slightly dimmed. It's very clever. Should I demonstrate? Is it interesting? So the lights are incredibly clever that you turn them off with one click, but then when you turn them on, you can choose how bright you have them. You can stop pressing the button at any point. So this is very bright, but then if you wanted to stop halfway through, so it's quite dimmed, it's a really lovely touch. And then there's a very similar switch just on this side, where there's quite a few different options for the few different windows, and you can just, in a very high-tech way, you can hear it, you can hear it closing. I'm not sure which one it is, I'll be past that one. But yeah, all very high-tech touches.
I've seen them.
Yeah, we haven't got to that stage yet. We haven't got to that stage. Still too new. I'm sending Chloe up there.
They're looking for a volunteer.
Yeah.
But isn't that a booking mistake, don't we? Because I remember working with you before, and what they used to always say, always think of it from the perspective.
Oh, it's all right. Jo's thought of everything. She has thought of everything. Sorry, go
I
on.
mean, a one-story building is not really considered.
Yeah.
I mean, you're still at one story. It's still a person with a ladder. Is still absolutely fine. So we didn't really get into that realm of like having to sort of mitigate risk in that manner, in that way.
I'm just going to add, a couple of things from a client's perspective. I hope you can all appreciate it. It's lovely sitting in here tonight. This is the volunteers room. It's not really my room, but I sneak in here and use it on days that we're closed because I love being in here. And it is a real joy to be in a room that is so light and bright. And, it's evening time now, but, whatever time of day, it's light and bright. It feels uplifting. It never feels depressing. And this is a slightly sad comment, but I think it's an important one to share. Over the Jubilee, I went to quite a few sort of village celebrations, and very often villages have had lovely village halls built for them, and they've had quite a lot of public money, Heritage Lottery Fund money and so on, and they often look rather gorgeous from the outside, but you go inside them and they're quite often it's too far to say depressing, but they're not inspiring buildings. The ceiling is quite low and they feel really box-like. What I love about this is the light at the top lifts it, the fabulous ceiling lifts it. It's genuinely an inspiring space. And I really, really want to use this as a showcase. This is what Pitzhanger does and should be doing, which is demonstrating how really creative, innovative work by a great design team at a really tight, unmentionable budget can achieve fantastic results, which celebrates the old, but also celebrates the modern. And I'm really excited by that.
Can I ask you a question? I'm sure it's on your agenda, but the chairs, I see one gift wrap there. What's the ideal for the flexible approach to the fixtures and fittings? Obviously, you've done a great job of the environment, but it's the budget obviously stops and
Well, you're absolutely right. So what we did actually on the chair was that we looked at somebody else who had similarly had an issue of, this is a multifunctional space, and we need sometimes to have lots of people in here sitting, and you are not on these chairs because we haven't funded them yet. So you're on our other existing chairs. But we looked to another organisation that needs to think about flexibility in its space, stackability, great British design, and also environmentally suitable production. And who is that? That is British Cathedrals, because they constantly have to use the spaces for different uses. So they recently had a competition to design a really good chair, and one of the criteria was it had to be stackable. So we know we'll have about 26 of these chairs in total, but some days we'll want to have this empty for people to have a stand-up reception. Sometimes we'll want to have a lecture, sometimes it'll be a board meeting, so they have to be stackable. And there were, I think, four chair designs that won that cathedrals competition, and this is one of them. British made, British designed, wooden, beautifully stackable, robust and comfortable.
And presumably you get the benefit then that it's a chair that you can say, I want so many of them, and you're getting the benefit of that. So chairs are obviously one element. What about kind of tables? Is that next on?
That's next on our agenda. And to be absolutely honest, we are literally, as a charity, we literally have no spare money for these things. So we will make do in the short term with trestle tables that we already have and put those up for board meetings and take them down. Over time, we might do a similar thing of finding an equally beautifully designed table, but it has to be pragmatic. This whole room has to be pragmatic, so it has to be
ironically, actually, when you describe a trestle table in terms of the simplicity, because other tables tend to be quite complicated when you try and store them, but trestle, quality made trestles and tops actually could be a more sustainable and appropriate solution. So sometimes the simplicity would follow through.
It's interesting. And also you'll see actually that apart from the very clever little bits of storage that Joe's put in behind the panels here, one of the options was to put a cupboard along here for storage, but we just decided we couldn't spare that space. It was too important to get the maximum out of it. I think these chairs are beautiful enough to sit here stacked. They'll look lovely. So those are some of the trade-offs that you have to make. You could have a cupboard to store your stuff in, but then you lose people space.
We did go through quite a lot of different spatial arrangements, didn't we? So the flexibility of the space.
You have all the configurations.
We did explore various, and so in order to install the audiovisual, all that, we had a good understanding of
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
the various configurations might be.
Yeah, I'm going to share with you also another of our challenges that, again, Joe rose to this beautifully. So right behind you, you might see there's a jib door there. As Joe's explained, you know, this, and you can see very clearly, this wall is not straight. So at one stage, one idea was there's be a complete box inside here. So out on Mattock Lane, out there is a rather beautiful old Victorian door that comes into here. And I rather like the idea of keeping that, but once the box was going in here, it became almost impossible. So we sort of lost sight of that and it got lost. But actually, as the construction was going on, we realized that the builders were still using that, and they had built the walls all around it, but they were still using that door. And what we said to Joe was, actually, if there was any way that we could retain it, we would love to, because although the main access is always going to be through here, and we don't want to have multiple access for security reasons, you know, one day this TV screen will break down, or there'll be something big that we have to bring in. Being able to have access direct onto the street is incredibly useful. So Joe came up with this super idea. We didn't want to lose wall space. We don't know what we want the wall space for, but we wanted to make sure we had it. And so she's created this lovely jib door. The pavement's on completely the wrong height, so the door is up there, but she's created a clever little step that lives inside that hole. We didn't want to lose the insulation, but again, by putting the jib door in, we've kept the beautiful looking old door on the outside, so it hasn't lost its lovely appearance on the outside, and quite the reverse, it's been repainted and rather protected, but we've still got that access. And so I think that was yet another example of Joe's responsiveness to the client's needs and coming up with solutions to our challenges.
We should mention the contractor.
Yes.
Patrick.
JK London.
JK, yes.
JK London. They were amazing. Absolutely. I mean, the skill of putting this together was.
And CNC projects.
Yeah. We were nervous about that because we knew that Joe's design relied on having really competent people doing something they hadn't done somewhere else before. So we were nervous about that. And obviously we couldn't afford to have huge, big, whopping, great big contractors because their price would have been completely out of scope for us. But no, JK London were absolutely brilliant. The other thing I'm just going to draw your attention to, and I'm sure you've all seen, but a little touch by Joe, which is very, very Sonian, is, as Joe explained, the wall there on Mattock Lane is high. I think this is such a weird shape, this whole building before we started, but the wall, you can just see it through the window up there. It starts high and then it comes down to the height of the datum here. And so that section is the only section of the roof light is covered by a wall, that side. So Joe, rather than having it panelled with ply, it's with glass, with mirror. And that's exactly what Stone would have done. So that's a lovely touch that throws back the light at us. I also, this thing of the roof light floating, I don't know how many of you have been inside to the roof light at the top of Pitzhanger. It's not open all the time, but we do arrange visits up to it. So if anyone would like to, please do speak to the front of house team and we'll arrange a visit for you. But one of the fascinating things about Soane's roof light on the manor is it's a huge roof light that brings in a lot of light, but it doesn't go anywhere in the manor except for that very, very top floor. So it's slightly weird. He puts this whopping great big thing on that brings light into the servants' quarters. So we decided during the project, we were really humming and hawing about this. We decided he did it for two reasons. One, the external point of view, he loved having the central roof light. And at night, when he had a party, something we do is we light it up from inside and it acts as this amazing beacon, drawing people there. But the other reason was to show off to people, I can do this for you. But what's weird about it, therefore, is it does float across multiple rooms. So you're in one room and the ceiling, the walls go up to a certain height and then they go into the next room. And it is just like this. So again, I love having this bit that overlaps because it's just bringing a tiny bit of Soane in 1800 into this contemporary piece here. Any other questions?
So can I just pick up the question that they mentioned about conservation, etc. This is building was one of the things that we just couldn't afford to start the project and then that. But when we did have a conservation officer, one of the things they were very, very keen on was that this building didn't abut the actual lodge itself because it's grade 2, grade 1.
Yeah, grade 2, yeah.
So this actually we had the conservation officer would met with a approval with what it would be done. So I think it's useful building.
We did actually get consent to put the glass roof in, didn't we? So we did manage to get something approved. We just ultimately chose for various reasons not to actually go ahead with it.
And have you submitted it for an RIBA award or other?
Not yet, in the process, but I really hope it does, because I really want it to be a sort of beacon for you can do fantastic design with low carbon footprint at low cost for I do see this as a village hall example of something super that can be done and creatively. So I really hope it wins some.
Can I ask you, try to earn income from this?
Yes, we're really struggling with that. So we didn't design it to be income generating. We designed it as a community feature. So we found out very early on when we were doing work that there is a need in Ealing for a communal space because there isn't room in town hall anymore. And so we wanted to have a space that, you know, the Alzheimer's Society or whatever can meet in the evenings. Obviously, we need it for our volunteers during the day. So we didn't design it as a commercial space. Interestingly, since our plans, COVID has struck and every organisation has been challenged financially to the limit. So one of the questions we've been asked by our trustees is absolutely make it available for community usage, but if there's also commercial usage, we must do that too. And we'll have a commercial rate and a community rate.
Yeah, but that's what most trustees have to do. You can, and this is real free money. You can do it wherever you like.
Yeah. So we
post COVID, a lot of the offices around here or businesses have reduced their office space.
Yeah.
So and then when I have a team,
they need to have a space, and this is a lovely space. For
when the awards, you'll get all the notoriety and there'll be a queue.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think it should be a nice earning that way.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So presumably in the lodge there are toilets and things.
Yes. So again, you know, this is one of the big debates we had as the client. You know, obviously that it would be nice if it was completely self-contained, if it had a loo in it, if it had a sink in it, so people could make teas and coffees and so on. But that would have taken up our budget completely, but it would have also taken up space here. So we did decide that it would be dependent on the lodge. The other thing that we decided is that accessibility, which is an issue close to my heart at the moment, as you can see me hobbling in on my crutches, is that it has to be flat access, but the flat access is from the forecourt. So it's not flat access straight from the street. You have to come into Pitzhanger and in here. But we've decided that that's something we can manage. Obviously, we need to make available our office kitchen and our office loo.
I think using the two together again makes a lot of sense and sustainability wise and just practicality wise.
Yeah.
Just a mundane question about volunteer storage. Is any of that storage? Did you consider storage, or did you think there just wasn't the space? Yeah, no, we did. We thought about storage very hard. Yeah.
We thought about storage and about having lockers when that was going to be a covered space. We thought, would we put lockers there? So actually, we decided in the end not to have any formal storage in here for exactly the same reason that we said before, was we just wanted to keep the space flexible. As you can see, we haven't yet fully kitted out the space and we're slowly building up our stock of chairs and so on. One of the things we might put in, for example, is a bench that is also a storage thing that's movable, that people can put things in. At the moment, the volunteers are quite comfortable about leaving a bit of stuff, doing their stint, coming back and picking it up. So actually, it's one of those things we want to live with and get feedback from the volunteers about how it works and if there's anything we should do differently.
There's always a danger of over-designing. I mean, architects are notorious for doing that and trying to sort of design every, eventuality. And I think it is quite a good idea to sometimes just let things evolve.
Yeah.
And I think the simplicity of the programme has allowed the architecture to sort of shine really.
And mobile solutions give you that flexibility.
Yeah.
as well, don't they?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Any more? No. Well, it just remains for me just to say thank you very much indeed for coming. Please do come back to other events at Pitzhanger. I think you've got a what's on. If you haven't got a what's on your chair, let me know and we can get you on. But please come back. We are building up our Thursday lates program. The last Thursday of every month, we do a special program of activities open till 8:30 on Thursday lates. We've got another interesting talk about Crossrail and the architecture of Crossrail coming up. Whole program of activities. Rana Begum, the fabulous exhibition I hope you've all seen that's on in the gallery at the moment. It's absolutely beautiful and it extends through into the manor. So please do come back and see that. Do sign up to Pitzhanger to find out more about what's going on. But lovely to see you this evening. And a big thank you, not just for tonight to Joe and Steve, but for their amazing, amazing work and for being such a joy to work with. As I say, I don't think every building project is always a joy, but this one really, really was. It was a real pleasure from beginning to end. So thank you both very much.